The fine-tuning or teleological argument is a common argument used by theists to argue for the existence of God, and it's a pretty powerful argument. The argument focuses on that the conditions that allow for life in the universe can only occur when certain fundamental physical constants are within a very narrow range. If one of many fundamental constants are off slightly, the universe would be unfit for the development of matter, astronomical structures, elemental diversity, or life for that matter. So since these things are so finely tuned, it appears that intelligent designer may have been involved in making sure these things happen so life could occur. Take for example the critical density of the universe. In the book The Language of God, Francis Collins explains how finely tuned this is. If the critical density was off by just 1 part in 10 to the 15th power, the universe would either collapse or expand too rapid for stars to form. This degree of precision is like taking $10 trillion in pennies, painting just one red, blindfolding someone, and asking him to pick out the red penny. The odds he will pick out the red penny are 1 in 10 to the 15th power. And this is just one of many characteristics of the universe that reveals extreme fine-tuning. The greatest and most finely tuned discovery to this day is the cosmological constant. While the critical density of the universe is finely tuned to 10 to the 15th power, the cosmological constant is finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. Meaning if the cosmological constant was off by just 1 part in a trillion, the universe would expand too quickly or not fast enough to form stars and allow life to exist. This and other examples is extremely good evidence that a creator had to have his hand in designing the universe, because when you take all the finely tuned constants and put them together, the odds of them all happening by accident is far beyond exceptionally rare. However, despite this, this is not proof of God. There are alternative explanations as to why so many things are so finely tuned in the universe, and we theists need to accept that. Daniel Dennett, for example, has argued the multiverse theory, which states that it is possible there are countless other universes in addition to our own. Each universe has different properties, different laws, and different values of the basic constants of physics. And given countless other universes, Dennett thinks all the possible distributions of values over the cosmological constants would have been tried out. As it happens, we find ourselves in the one universe where the constants are such as to allow for the development of life. And this explanation could be true and explain why everything appears to be finely tuned. However, there is no guarantee that the process, which produces endless amounts of universes, would randomly set all the parameters in a way that every possibility is realized. It could be that there are constraints on the characteristics of these many universes, and the production process itself would have to be finely tuned in some way to guarantee that we get enough variety of universes. Also, suggesting there is an infinite number of universes just to explain our own is contrary to Occam's razor, which is the principle that says the best explanation is the one that makes the fewest assumptions. Arguing there is an endless amount of universes makes far more assumptions than arguing for an intelligent designer. Richard Swinburne says, "It is the height of irrationality to postulate an infinite number of universes, never causally connected with each other, merely to avoid the hypothesis of theism. Given that simplicity makes for prior probability, and a theory is simpler the fewer entities it postulates, it is far simpler to postulate one God than an infinite number of universes, each differing from each other in accord with regular formula, uncaused by anything else." So there are problems with the multiverse theory, but Alvin Plantinga has noticed something else about it. He has demonstrated in the form of an analogy. It goes like this. Imagine yourself at a poker game. One of the other players is dealing the cards, and for the past 20 hands, he has dealt himself 4 aces each turn. After the last hand, you and the other players get up ready to shoot the guy. But suddenly the dealer says, "I know it looks suspicious, guys, but possibly there is an infinite succession of universes, so that for any possible distribution of possible poker hands, there is a universe in which that possibility is realized. We just happen to find ourselves in the one where someone like me always deals himself only aces and wild cards without ever cheating. It could be the case you can't prove I'm cheating." So if you were at the game, how would you respond? Would you sit back down and assume that could be the case and keep playing? Or would you recognize that possibility is exceptionally rare, and it is far more likely the dealer is cheating? That it is far more likely intelligence was used in instituting where the cards are going, and it is not random chance that the aces keep ending up in the dealer's hand? That is exactly the same idea behind the fine-tuning argument. In everyday life, when we encounter situations that seem to be rigged, we do not assume it is chance. We know intelligent design when we see it. It could be the case that it is just random chance, but we know the odds are never in that favor. So when we encounter odds like the ratio of electromagnetic force to gravity being finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, or the cosmological constant being finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, logically we shouldn't say, well, it's possible by accidental chance there is a trillion universes, and we just happen to be in the one that is capable of producing life. Especially when we encounter odds that high in a possible situation in life, like a poker game, we wouldn't believe it is just random chance. So although the fine-tuning argument cannot prove the existence of an intelligent designer, it shows us that the existence of God is far more logical than everything just happening by random chance. This is the very question many philosophers and scientists have been asking lately. Although the question would have been ridiculed decades ago, a different picture is now emerging. The results of experimental and theoretical data have been producing some strange results that do not tell us our world is objectively real, but emerging from something else altogether. And in the rise of the digital age, we are starting to see a correlation between our world and the world of a virtual reality. The very notion that our world is virtual, or dreamlike, is explored by Brian Whitworth. He took the two possibilities, one being the realist hypothesis, that our world is physical, exists in and of itself, and needs nothing outside of it to explain it, and the other being the virtual reality hypothesis, that our world exists as a virtual reality, depending on information processing happening outside of space-time. He looked at all the facts we know from experimental data, and asked which hypothesis better fits the data. After looking through it all, the conclusion was obvious. The data better fits the idea we are a virtual reality. Our world makes more sense if we look at it as a virtual world, and not an objective one existing independently. He started at the beginning, the Big Bang. This established fact that space-time was created from a single event billions of years ago. Although hypotheticals have been proposed to get around this beginning point, the fact remains, our universe, space-time, began to exist. From the view that our universe is all there is, as an objective independent reality, this makes no sense. How does space-time emerge from nothing? But if we look at the universe as a virtual reality, the Big Bang fits perfectly. Virtual worlds must begin with information influx from nothing. Brian Whitworth says, virtual reality theory fits well with the Big Bang. No virtual reality can have existed forever, since it needs a processor to start up. Every time one starts a computer game or boots up a computer, such a Big Bang occurs. From the perspective of the virtual world itself, the creation is always from nothing. As before the virtual world startup, there was indeed no time or space as defined by that world. Another thing to look at is quantum minima. The fact that things like light are quantized as photons better fits the hypothesis that we are a virtual reality. In digital processing, all events and objects must have a minimal quantity that cannot be reduced anymore, and yet our world has the same effect.
Every computer-generated image, no matter how realistic, breaks down into pixels when you get close enough. You might think this doesn't happen in the real world, but you'd be wrong. In the past century, physicists have discovered that matter really is made of tiny little pixels, fundamental, indivisible particles billions of times smaller than an atom.
Look at the way the universe behaves. It's quantized. It's made of pixels. It's made of individual atoms. Space is quantized. Time is quantized. Energy is quantized. Everything is made of individual pixels, which means the universe has a finite number of components, which means it has a finite number of states, which means it's computable.
And that the true nature of the universe is indeed digital, that we have smallest space, smallest time, and that there's nothing that you cannot compute. And at the moment, there is no evidence against that.
What about the fact that there is a maximum speed, the speed of light? Events in a virtual world must have a maximum rate limited by a finite processor, and our world has a maximum speed. Einstein deduced that nothing travels faster than light from the way the world works, but this does not explain why the world had to be that way. Why cannot an object's speed simply keep increasing? If light is like a classical wave, its speed should depend upon the elasticity and inertia of the medium it travels through. If light travels through the medium of empty space, its speed should depend upon the elasticity and inertia of space. However, how can empty space have properties? Virtual reality theory explains this, but objective reality cannot. There is also how space curving of massive objects and time dilating at high speeds correlates to virtual processing load effects. High matter concentrations in our universe may constitute a high processing demand, so massive objects would slow down the information processing of space-time. In the same way, high amounts of data processing in a computer slow the processing speed down. The fact that all quantum objects are identical to each other correlates to digital equivalence, in that in a virtual world, every digital object created by the same code is identical. The same holds true for quantum particles. And these are just a few of the 11 facts Brian Whitworth lists. He concludes by saying, individually, none of the above short points is convincing, but taken together they constitute what a court might call circumstantial evidence, favoring virtual reality against objective reality. When coincidences mount up, they present a plausibility argument, if not a proof. More powerful evidence is provided by cases which a virtual reality theory explains easily, but which objective reality approaches have great difficulty with. And this is only the beginning. In the hunt for a theory of quantum gravity, the theoretical data better fits the idea we are a virtual reality. Both underlying string theory and loop quantum gravity is the holographic principle. The idea of the three-dimensional universe emerges from information processing on a 2D surface.
Maybe the three-dimensional objects, us, everything in the world around us, maybe all of the information in these objects is carried, is smeared around a distant two-dimensional surface that surrounds us, and we're just in some sense a holographic projection of that distant data.
The holographic principle tells us something quite astonishing. It says that our ideas of volume, of the real world in a sense, might be a kind of illusion.
We forget about what space is and what time, and then somehow the information, by thinking about how much information is, what information is doing, then the space-time will, what we call, be emergent. It will come out of just a bunch of zeros and ones.
It should be clear that this whole holographic story is the most radical thing that has happened to our understanding of space, time, matter, since the invention of quantum mechanics and relativity.
Now, someone could always dismiss the theoretical data, but that would be impractical, because it would take away our best chance for a theory rectifying relativity in quantum mechanics. Even so, the experimental data cannot be ignored, and the results of quantum mechanics infers the same implications we see in the holographic principle.
Quantum mechanics means it's possible everything we see could really be produced by lines of code inside a powerful computer.
So we cannot ignore the recent experimental data, like the fact that for objective reality to be true, and the world to exist independent of observation, something known as locality would have to follow, which means for objects to interact, they need to be in close proximity. But experiments in the early 80s showed this is not the case. Instant interaction can be seen between two particles that are separated from great distances. This is what we now know as entanglement, and it makes more sense if the world is virtual. In a virtual world, space doesn't limit correlations. All points in a virtual world are equal distance with respect to the source of their simulation. So for example, in computers, all points on a screen are equal distance with respect to the CPU. Processors can ignore screen distance, and the same thing happens in our world. If our universe is a three-dimensional screen, its processing is equal distance to all points in the universe. So the non-local collapse of a quantum wave function could be such an effect. Space seems to be an illusion created by the virtual construct, which is something Einstein came to realize at the end of his lifetime. Hence it is clear that the space of physics is not, in the last analysis, anything given in nature or independent of human thought. It is a function of our conceptual scheme. Space as conceived by Newton proved to be an illusion. But even more strange than this is what quantum physics tells us about matter. Prior to observation, matter doesn't exist. This was demonstrated in the 1920s by the double slit experiment. The existence of matter is dependent on observation, and recent experiments have not only reconfirmed this, but have debunked theories in order to avoid the conclusion that the existence of matter is observation dependent. Now many accept that particles do not exist prior to observation, but they exist in a state of a wave, which then forms into particles upon measurement. But this would be false. As they point out in the quantum enigma, quantum probability is not the probability of where an atom is, it is the objective probability of where you or anybody will find it. The atom wasn't someplace until it was observed to be there, which is what Heisenberg said years ago. The atom or elementary particles themselves are not real. They form a world of potentialities, or possibilities, rather than one of the things or facts. But what does this all mean?
These basic rules of quantum mechanics apply to all tiny subatomic particles. When we look at them, they are just dots. When we look away, they lose their physical form.
A different way of looking at that is to say, well, how parallel is this behavior with what I see in my PlayStation 3 when I'm playing a video game? In a PlayStation 3, and for an example of that is SimCity. It's an enormous city. I can navigate my way through every bit of it because the PlayStation, the video game, gives me the frame that I need when I'm looking there. If I look somewhere else, it'll create that frame. Well, oddly enough, the universe behaves that way in reality. The universe gives you what you're looking at when you're looking at it. When you're not looking at it, it's not necessarily there.
Our world is pixelated and only assumes definite form when observed, the very same way our computer simulations behave.
The conclusion is inescapable. The universe behaves as a virtual reality. In light of the evidence, this is why this question is now taken seriously by experts. Which brings us to the next question.
The more interesting aspect to that question is, who's the programmer and where's the computer?
If the universe is a simulation, who is the simulator? Should we take the view of Nick Bostrom, that we are being simulated by future humans as an ancestor simulation? Well, the problem with this theory is it really doesn't answer the question. If we are being simulated by future humans, then their world would have to have the same features as ours and be based on qubits, and this would imply they are also a simulation. Using Leibniz's law and discernibility of identicals, it would have to follow that they are also a simulation, if they have the exact same world as ours, just further in the future. If the properties of our world entail that we are a virtual reality, then a world identical to ours would have the same implications, but if their world needs outside processing, they would also need a simulator. And if they are also being simulated by a future civilization, then the cycle continues, and it is nothing more than an infinite regress. Bostrom admits this and says, we would have to suspect that the post-humans running our simulation are themselves simulated beings, and their creators in turn may also be simulated beings. Reality may thus contain many levels. So this amounts to nothing more than an infinite regress. But what if one of the higher levels is not a quantum world, but an actual objective world based on classical physics? Well, this solution creates more problems than it solves. For a quantum world like ours to be simulated in a classical world, all of the qubits would have to be unpacked into classical bits, and this would result in a classical computer hard drive bigger than that which is being simulated, so a computer bigger than the universe itself, which would be absurd to postulate and impossible to build, which leaves us with a different alternative. The universe is being simulated in a mind.
Could what we think is the universe be some sort of vault of heaven rather than a real thing?
Given the problems that result from being simulated on a computer, one can find a much simpler explanation that the universe is being simulated in a mind. This would solve many problems of being simulated on a computer, because a mind has elements of integrated information states and also processes information, and the physics in a dream environment would emerge from information processing and therefore look identical to the conditions of our world as we described earlier. So a dream environment just emerges from platonic information in a mind, which is essentially the same type of physics we see in a generic information construct, such as the illusion of space and matter and the elements which make it finite and computable. Even more important, a mind, different from the brain in a computer, is an immaterial substance and doesn't require matter to exist. In fact, interestingly enough, matter seems to need mind, since this is what quantum mechanics tells us. Mind is necessary to collapse a wave function for matter to exist.
So recent experiments led by a group at the University of Vienna, Austria, provide the most compelling evidence yet that there is no objective reality beyond what we observe. So it's really the observation that creates the reality. And what they found is that Leggett's inequality is violated as well as Bell's. Even if you allow for instantaneous influences, quantum measurements do not fit with the idea of an objective reality.
So a mind, unlike a computer, doesn't require the existence of particles to be built upon. So given the options, the most likely case is the universe is actually being simulated in an immaterial necessary mind.
An all-powerful, all-knowing, super-intelligent being. An entity whose motives are unfathomable.
It's very important for us physicists to not dismiss ideas just because they're weird. Because if we did, we would have already dismissed atoms, black holes, and all sorts of other marvelous things.
But from this deduction, we can then formulate a simple argument. Premise 1. Simulations can only exist in a computer or in a mind. Premise 2. The universe is a simulation. This, of course, comes from the evidence presented earlier. Premise 3. A simulation on a computer still must be simulated in a mind. This would follow from the infinite regress problem if we were being simulated on a computer. To prevent the infinite regress of endless computer simulations, we eventually have to stop postulating higher levels of computers and stop with a simulation existing in a necessary mind. And we would also have to remember the importance of Occam's razor. If we have to inevitably arrive at the conclusion of existing in a mind, then why even postulate intermediate levels of computer simulations, unless it is necessary to do so? And no reason suggests this. And one can also argue that it may not even be possible to simulate conscious beings in a computer. given this hasn't been demonstrated to be possible, and one can argue that consciousness is more complex than just information processing. So Occam's razor shaves these off. But even if one insists on leaving them there, the universe would still exist in a mind anyway. So inevitably, we have to say premise 4. Therefore, the universe is a simulation in a mind. Premise 5. This mind is what we call God. And the conclusion simply follows. What is the mind? What is the universe? Are they one and the same? Is one an illusion created by the other? Are these questions meaningless to begin with? Why even ask them? In recent videos, we have discussed the strange results of quantum mechanics and its implications. Mind is fundamental. Realism has been falsified, and matter doesn't exist independent of measurement. The scientific evidence has piled up and led us to this conclusion. However, through a simple deduction, we can see that these conclusions have been right in front of us the whole time. So without further delay, let us begin. Premise 1. The mind exists. No one with a mind can doubt this. Whether you think the mind is an emergent property of the brain or a fundamental substance, you cannot doubt that your mind exists.
What I mean by consciousness is the one thing in this universe that can't be an illusion. Consciousness is the fact of experience, the fact that something is happening. The fact the lights are on in some basic sense, even if we don't understand anything.
Premise 2. The properties of the mind are not that which matter can have. This can be seen with the difference between mental properties and physical properties. Consider two things: feeling pain and an electrical signal to the brain. Are they the same thing? Of course not, because an electrical signal to the brain can happen without the feeling of pain. What we experience is a correlation between an electrical signal and the mental feeling of pain. But one can see the coherence of a possible world where one experiences pain without the need for an electrical signal. The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel says, if a mental event is really a physical event in this sense, and nothing else, then the physical event by itself, once its physical properties are understood, should likewise be sufficient for the taste of sugar, the feeling of pain, or whatever it is supposed to be identical with. But it doesn't seem to be. It seems conceivable for any physical event, there should be a physical event without any experience at all. Experience of taste seems to be something extra, contingently related to the brain states, something produced rather than constituted by the brain state. So it cannot be identical to the brain state in the way that water is identical to H2O. The point is that things like qualia are not physical substances. What we experience is mental substances like qualia, and then we assume they come from physical substances in and of themselves. But a mental substance, like the taste of sugar, does not exist with the physical substance. They are nothing more than the mental experience and all we really know. And then we just assume they correlate to physical properties. Therefore, upon examination, mental properties and physical properties are conceptually detached. No amount of introspection can ever reduce to the chemistry of the brain.
There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head. Okay, you can feel, you can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head, or synapses in your head that are doing anything.
But since we know that the mental experience is not a necessary property of a physical substance, then they cannot be the same thing, and the mental substance is something separate in all we truly experience. Thus our first conclusion is, mind is not reducible to matter. Premise 3. Substance dualism is false. According to substance dualism, there are two fundamental kinds of substances, matter and mind. However, this view quickly leads to problems regarding the interaction of matter and mind. The internal contradictions of interactionism demonstrate that two fundamental types of substances cannot interact. If they did, they would interact via a shared property. However, if they share a property, then they are not separate substances at all. Either mind shares a physical property with matter, or matter shares a mental property with mind. As such, substance dualism becomes incoherent on close inspection and must be rejected. Though obvious to many, these three premises lead us to a conclusion that many find unacceptable. However, with a simple deduction, the conclusion is inescapable. If the mind exists and cannot be reduced to matter, and if substance dualism is false, then no other substance exists. Thus we conclude, all is mind, the universe is a mental construct. without surprise to idealists, this is what the experimental results of quantum mechanics tells us. Matter is not fundamental in and of itself, but cannot exist prior to measurement, which was pointed out in our last two videos, and the properties of matter have no independent existence beyond how one chooses to measure them.
That there is no objective reality beyond what we observe.
What we perceive as reality now depends on our earlier decision what to measure.
Thus, the argument is not a mere a priori logical possibility, or just an interesting thought, but in fact predicts the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. The evidence suggests the universe is fundamentally mental.
It processes and stores information at the microscopic level on everything we see around us. And if the universe is processing information, then it must be thinking. And it must be alive.
This would come to no surprise to many of the pioneers of quantum theory. Max Planck famously said, "There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter." Sir Rudolf Peirce said, "The moment at which you can throw away one possibility and keep only the other is when you finally become conscious of the fact that the experiment has given one result." You see, the quantum mechanical description is in terms of knowledge, and knowledge requires somebody who knows. Now, is there an escape from this? What about property dualism? Could one just use premise 1 and premise 2 to arrive at property dualism? That the mental world is just a property of physical substances, and therefore doesn't reduce to its own substance, but is just a separate property emergent from matter. However, this is not parsimonious or verifiable, since we only interact through qualia on a mental level. If there is mental and physical properties of one substance, it is not parsimonious to posit separate properties that we do not interact with just to save an independent physical reality. However, more importantly, is that the mind cannot reduce to just a property. This can be shown in a simple deduction. Premise 1. If solipsism is conceivable, then a possible world could exist such that only the mind exists. Solipsism is of course the view that only your mind exists and everything else is an illusion of it. Premise 2. Solipsism is conceivable. Therefore a possible world exists with only a mind in it. Premise 3. Possible worlds cannot only consist of properties or processes, but must also include entities. Premise 4. There is no difference between the mind existing in a solipsis world and the actual world. This stems from Leibniz's law indiscernibility of identicals. If there are any two things, and if they are identical to each other, then for what is true of one will be true of the other. Therefore the conclusion is, thus the mind cannot be a property or a process, and therefore physical property dualism doesn't escape the argument. Now some would be scared by this argument because they would assume it leads to solipsism. But as we said in our last video, Richard Kahn Henry and Stephen Palmquist point out, a theistic view of our existence becomes the only rational alternative to solipsism. One doesn't need to jump to the extreme idealist view that only your mind exists, but simply hold to the view that the mental world creates the construct of the physical world. Many philosophers have also noted that we are not in control of the way the universe behaves, and therefore it is not reasonable to assume that it is just a creation of only your mind. But if all is mind, then we have to deduce that it is dependent on a much larger mind, which is why theism is the only rational alternative to solipsism. Although this position may be rejected by many as unacceptable and hold to the notion of a mind-independent reality, the conclusion still follows. In fact, we cannot even conceive of a mind-independent reality without a mind. As Max Planck said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness." So as we said, this argument is not just a clever thought, but in fact predicts the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. But what about those who still reject these philosophical implications? Well, as Ian Squires said, it is probably fair to say that most members of the physics community would reject these ideas. However, the reasons would be based more on prejudice than on sound argument, and the proportion of those who reject it would be much smaller if we considered only those who had actually thought carefully about the problems of quantum theory.